All right, we're going to call the Admin and Finance Committee to order. We start with a roll call, please.
Dr. Bophy? Dr. Bophy is present. Mr. Davis?
Present.
Mr. Davis is present. Ms. Edmonston? Mr. Edmonston is not present. Mr. Garvey? Mr. Garvey is not present. Ms. Holloway? Ms. Holloway is present. Dr. Jones?
Present.
Dr. Jones is present. Ms. Lewis? Ms. Lewis is not present. Ms. Orange Jones? She's here.
She's present.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Ms. Orange Jones?
Present.
Ms. Orange Jones is present. Mr. Rock?
Present.
Mr. Rock is present. Dr. Thomason? Present. Dr. Thomason is present. Ms. Vautier? Here. Ms. Vautier is present.
And Ms. Edmondson has joined us.
We have quorum.
All right, our first item.
Your consent agenda is ready for approval, adding items 6.1 and 8.1 and pulling item 8.1.
Second.
We have a motion second. So we have pulled these. We want to go ahead and address the one we pulled.
We can take 8.1.
All right, so taking 8.1, I do have some comment cards. If board, if you would allow me to bring them down, then we'll go from that point. Could I have Mr. Donald Sanji come forward, Superintendent Michael Falk, and Mr. Scott Richard, please? Thank you, gentlemen. Just make sure your green light's on and everybody can hear you. You want to start with Sanji?
Good morning. Thank you for allowing me to speak. I'm Donald Sanji. I'm the Education Policy Advisor to the Governor. Wanted to make sure everyone was clear as far as the Governor's position on the MFP. He, first of all, in general, he would be supportive of any increase in the MFP. He feels like to adequately fund public schools, there needs to be more money in it than it is right now. Given the environment of what's going on in the state with the budget and the legislature and so forth, he is proposing an executive budget that has an increase inside of the MFP a total of $18 million. And this is with the understanding that $8 million of the $18 million would go toward high-cost services, and $10 million would go to supplemental course allocations. As part of the MFP task force discussion, there was quite a bit of discussion, and there got to be kind of a parliamentary, just a lot of stuff with motions and substitute motions and amended motions and withdrawn motions, and we could support an increase in the MFP for the per pupil. At that point, we just wanted to leave it open in case the financial picture of the state changed and there was an opportunity for an increase. We didn't want to stop BESE from proposing that if, for some reason, it was able to be funded in the governor's budget. But as it stands right now, it's no different than it was at that time. So his recommendation, or his executive budget, will include that $18 million increase within the MFP for those two items.
Thank you very much. Mr. Richard.
Good morning, BESE members, Chairman. Davis Scott Richard, Executive Director of the Louisiana School Boards Association. Here today asking you to support the recommendations of the MFP Task Force. The recommendations of the MFP Task Force were very, very well vetted, very well thought out, and focus on equity and adequacy, and focus on maintaining the block grant funding status of distribution of state dollars to local school districts to meet their individual needs. Of serious concern, and you'll probably hear this a little bit later this morning, is the governor's office has identified $18 million that targets specific programs. In the executive budget documents on the Division of Administration's website for everyone to see, public documents, I'll read the description of the $18 million. major changes from existing operating budget. $18 million. Provides funding outside of the minimum foundation program formula for an increase of $8 million for high-need students and an increase of $10 million for additional high school courses such as classes for college credit and career education students. So here's the rub. In the LDOE newsletter and in the document, the resolution, the formula that you're being asked to approve today, you're rolling $18 million into level 4 of the MFP resolution, which would hopefully mean it would be recurring. In the executive budget documents that address the minimum foundation program at the Division of Administration's website, the key word is provides funding outside the minimum foundation program. That is of serious concern to local school districts. That is why, the main reason why we would ask you to support the resolution that would include the MFP task force's suggestions by a vote of 12-6. And in closing, it's important that these major decisions be clear and unambiguous to local school districts. In the LDOE newsletter last week, the introduction focused on putting the money as new money inside the MFP resolution, which protects that funding. The executive budget documents indicate the money would be outside of the formula. There needs to be some type of reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you. Superintendent Falk.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the board, Michael Falk, Superintendent of Schools, Central Community School System, and also a member of the task force. And part of the reasoning for the task force supporting the priorities, which the first priority was to place it in the per pupil amount, was the fact that next year school systems are going to see a 1.1% increase in their retirement portion, which totals to $38 million statewide. This is not anything that we have any choice. We have to pay it. In addition, we have lost money, supplemental money, over the last 2 years. We had a $44 million appropriation that was outside the formula 2 years ago, and then last year that was reduced to $20 million. So we had a net reduction of $24 million. We have worked with supplemental appropriations outside of the formula, realizing that they for general purposes that school systems can use. Whenever you put something inside of the formula and you designate it, then you restrict the block grant concept that the formula was originally intended for. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. That concludes our comment cards for that item.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, ma'am.
Then Mr. Sanji, is that 18 million in the executive budget inside or outside the MFP?
Well, I mean, I first heard that yesterday, that it was outside. I had a conversation with Erin Monroe Wesley. I said, you know, before I come, I want to make it clear, is it inside the MFP? She said that it was, although it sounds like we want to get it fully clarified before you all finally vote on it. I'm in the process of maybe finding that out right now. But she told me that it was inside the formula. That's what she said, told me that yesterday. But I will, I'll get that clarified through her and the Division of Administration as soon as I can.
Members, the cat got out of the bag on this one a little bit because the item that you're going to be considering is not, you're not taking a vote right now. All you're doing is receiving minutes, and the people who are commenting about an issue that you're going to vote on later. It will be helpful maybe at this point for me to share with you, and I'll brief you on this later. The governor tells the legislature his proposal for how much money should be in the MFP. But the Constitution does not give the governor or the legislature any power to determine what's in the formula. Only you determine what's in the formula. So the questions that are being raised by Mr. Richard, Mr. Falk, and the question that Ms. Voce asked, you will answer later today by determining what's in the formula. And I will talk a little later about that process. So the governor's role is to say, here's how much money there is total. If the commissioner has represented it accurately or inaccurately, that's a question for them to determine in the budget. Your job is to vote on what's in the formula, and it is a fair thing to say that almost never does the exact amount in the formula represent the exact amount in the executive budget. And so we'll have that discussion later.
Right, I totally understand that. My question just went to the issue of within the executive budget for the MFP, was there an increase that was put in that reflected the 18 million within the MFP allocation?
Yeah, and our reading is yes.
And your reading of that?
Yes, our reading is yes, that there's actually $36 million of increase reflected in the executive budget. Yes, ma'am, yes.
Increase in 18
Correct.
for this?
Yes, ma'am, yeah.
Good deal. Anything else from the board? I'll remind you that we are just here to vote to receive this report. Thank you guys for your comments on that. If there's no comments, no further comments from the board, then we have any objections to receiving this report? With no objections, the report is received. I believe we have another consent, or did that take both?
Yes.
That's another consent. What is the next item? What will be the other consent item? 6.1?
No.
Or was that already done? We took everyone.
We took the rest.
Okay. So the next item of business then, please.
On page 22, item 4.1, consideration of the minimum foundation program formula for fiscal year 2017-2018. The LDE recommends that the board approve the 2017-2018 MFP formula, authorize the LDE to make technical changes to the MFP formula as needed, and authorize the LDE to submit the formula to the legislature by March 15, 2017. An updated exec rec when backup documentation for this item were posted on Friday, March the 3rd, and handouts have been distributed to the committee.
Board, you should have received that handout. I believe everyone has that. I need a motion, please. Dr. Jones, need a second? Ms. Holloway, Superintendent?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, members, let me just brief you on the process by which the MFP is developed, and this maybe will address some of the questions in the group. Under the Constitution, you are charged with creating an assessment of the cost of the minimum foundation of public education, and a formula for how that shall be distributed to the school systems and for what portion of the funds shall be provided by local taxpayers versus state taxpayers. That is what you have here today. When this is approved, and there must be an approved plan by March 15 submitted to the legislature then takes it up. They cannot adjust it. All they can do is either approve it or not approve it. And very often it will happen that they'll not approve it, and they'll say, here's our issues with it, and they'll send it back to us. And it could be that we have this same meeting 2 or 3 times over the course of the next couple of months to vote on different iterations of the formula. That's happened in the past. It could be that they just accept our formula. What you have in front of you today is an attempt to reflect a consensus with the governor's office, given our different roles. The governor's office is to determine how much money should be in the executive budget for different things. Your job is to determine how much cost of an education is there and who should pay the price. In this case, those two things are syncing up. And partially that's because the governor is represented on a task force that some of you sit on. Ms. Voce sits on this, Mr. Garvey sits on this, and Mr. Davis is the chairman of it. Also, Mr. Falk, who spoke earlier, Mr. Richard, who spoke earlier, and Mr. Sanji, who spoke earlier, are represented on this body. It's fair to say that the recommendation that you are getting today is not the exact recommendation that the task force recommended. It's not wildly different, but it's not the exact same one. Here's how it differs. The executive budget says that there shall be $18 million added to the formula, and the governor's essentially urging, although he doesn't officially have this power, but his urging is that it be done for $8 million for students with disabilities, a la the most disadvantaged students, and $10 million for additional courses, especially dual enrollment courses, that are currently unfunded in the formula. We know there are these demands because the funds that are sought by school systems for students with high-cost disabilities, the state is only able right now to reimburse barely a quarter of those costs. Secondly, dual enrollment dollars are tapped, and oversubscribed. As a result, the governor's proposal and the proposal you have in front of you here today is to try to meet both of those costs. In their comments earlier, Mr. Falk and Mr. Richard advocated not against those monies, but rather for unrestricting those monies, for making them a block grant. And, that's just a policy debate that we've got to have here. I don't think you're hearing a big debate about how much money there should be. You are proposing to add money to the formula. That's a good thing. It will keep schools relatively stable in a time when their costs are increasing, due especially to pension and health care obligations. But the debate is more about, should it be spent in line with what's in the governor's executive budget, or should it be spent more in line with what the task force recommended, which was an unrestricted block grant. We are coming to you proposing to stick with the governor's executive budget recommendation. Happy to talk about more of that as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Superintendent. And Board, we do have a number of comment cards for this, and so if it's the pleasure of the Board, I'll have those comments come up, and then we'll discuss from that point. If you would, we'll let all the commenters speak, and then we'll go to the Board. All right, could I have, let's see. Could I get Ms. Ashley McReynolds, Mr. Sean Fleming, Superintendent Falk, Ms. Leslie Lavoie, and Mr. Richard to come to the front. You may have to trade out on one of those, or two of them. I apologize to Mr. Lavoie. Who wants to begin? Ms. McReynolds, you want to go ahead? Make sure your mic's on, please.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Good morning, committee and chairman. Thank you for allowing me to speak today. My name is Ashley McReynolds. I'm a parent from here in East Spanish Parish. And since 2012, myself and other advocates have been urging BESE and the department to fix the inequities in the MFP. It's sad that 5 years later I'm back up here again urging you to amend the MFP and to direct the department to ensure that schools receive funding needed to serve the students they have enrolled and nothing more. While I'm grateful to be a part of the MFP task force, I just can't fathom why this proposed MFP wasn't brought to the task force to allow for authentic stakeholder input. This inequity has got to be fixed. The amount of money being siphoned out of the traditional public schools and going to charter schools is around $500 per child on average. So please, I ask you once again to tell the department to go back and amend the MFP to fix the inequity. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fleming.
Good morning. Sean Fleming with Louisiana Developmental Disabilities Council. I'd like to direct your attention to the first page of the MFP where it says Level 1. And it says Level 1 determines the minimum cost of education based on the education needs of each student. And that paragraph ends with, the cost is then shared equitably between the state and city parish school systems based on the ability of the systems to support education in their communities through local sales and property tax revenues. That statement is false. Well, I wouldn't say the statement is false, but how it is interpreted is not following the equitable distribution. I'll make it simple for you. I'll use bigger numbers in the MFP so you can follow it more easily. Kids with disabilities are added a weighted count of 2.5 kids in the formula. So if a kid costs $10,000 and the kid doesn't have disabilities, then a kid with the disabilities costs 2.5 times that, right? That's $25,000. So if you have 3 students, I'm just doing this for easy math for you, you can see how easy it works out. 2 kids without disabilities, without any add-on, a kid with disabilities. You have $10,000, $10,000, $25,000, you have $45,000. That is shared between the state and local. In some parishes it is higher percentage of local, in some parishes it's lower than the state share. But when you take it, that's how the state amount is calculated, that 45. When a student leaves, They've corrected the state share portion. So you would think they would take $10,000 with them if they don't have a disability. They had been taking the full 15. The full share, even though, because it was how it's divided, was based on an average amount. 2 years ago, the legislature clarified in 173995, which speaks to the charter school funding, which I think is problematic in and of itself that exists, but this issue has been brought forward repeatedly. The department is only correcting the state share. So instead of sending $15,000 for a kid, they'll send $12,500. And what's happening is that distribution of students is not the same across schools. The local share is not calculated equitably. So when you go to page 18 in the MFP, and it speaks to the local share, you can see how the divisor of the local cost is not done on a weighted share, it's done on an actual head count. But the MFP is not based on an actual head count. As that first statement says, it's based on the needs of students. So according to the MFP, we don't have 700,000 kids in the state, we have 900-something thousand kids. But when the department is taking money, the local share of money, it is acting like the needs of the kids do not matter anymore, and it is using a divider of an actual head count. And the amount is incredible. It's in the millions of dollars, and as you approve more charter schools, and later today you will be looking at the distributions of kids with disabilities and other risk factors that are in this MFP in charter schools. And some charter schools serve their fair share, and truthfully this isn't a big issue, but in some school systems, because the charter schools are not serving their fair share, and you have the data in front of you today, the interpretation of this formula is causing huge problems with the formula not being equitably distributed. It is not being followed. You can correct that if you go start on page 18 and tell the department to use a weighted count in the divisor for the local cost. You'll have to put weighted count throughout that document. And again, it is something we've been asking the department and BESE to do for about 5 to 6 years. And I urge you to consider doing that. Thank you.
Thank you. Superintendent?
In 1990, a suit was filed against the state of Louisiana to formulate an equitable MFP. Since full funding of the MFP was achieved under the Foster administration, funding for education has been piecemealed in various ways by the governor's office, the legislature, and BESE. Along the way, school districts have been impacted by increased personnel costs, such as retirement, step increases, and health care costs, as well as various reforms and mandates implemented by state and federal agencies. The net effect has been failure to address the requirements of the Louisiana Constitution, which says that we are to equitably fund a minimum program of education for public school students. Until such time that a comprehensive study and consideration of all reform measures and mandates, both state and federal, as well as true cost to provide the necessary resources on a per-pupil basis is determined, BESE should submit a formula which increases the per-pupil amount if additional funds are available per the recommendation of the MFP task force, rather than placing any increase in level 4 of the formula, which will reduce the equity factor in the formula. Thank you.
Thanks, sir. Mr. Richard?
Thank you again, Mr. Davis and members of the committee. You've heard lots of commentary about this process. You've heard from the Louisiana Developmental Disabilities Council. Their concerns have merit. It took legislation a couple of years ago to fix an initial concern on the state share. state cost allocation for special needs students and how it interacts with charter schools. That's a separate issue, but it has merit. Again, to reiterate, the process, Superintendent White discussed with you your responsibility and your role in determining a formula to distribute equitably state education dollars to public schools in our state. Words mean something. Words are important. You've heard discussions about litigation involving this process or this distribution of state dollars. You've heard the words equitable, adequacy. Many states are embroiled in long-standing litigation. We currently have litigation right now in our state regarding this process. That's why I've raised the issue about wording. If we're all going to work together as BESE, the department, traditional public schools, charter schools, the legislature, and the governor's office to champion a formula that distributes over $3.7 billion, we've got to get the wording right. And it makes a difference as to whether or not the identified $18 million in supposed new money, which we're very grateful for from the governor's office and his executive budget, is inside the formula or outside the formula, in the formula that you're going to be asked to approve in a few minutes. I'm not making this up. I've sent you all an email. It's what's in wording from the Division of Administration. It clearly states, provides funding outside of the minimum foundation program. That is important for all of the stakeholders to understand and to be on the same page. And to simply gloss over that discrepancy as insignificant is unacceptable. We're not talking about nickels and dimes. We're talking about dollars that affect children in our state. That's why we're asking you to clarify, delay till tomorrow, till you can reconcile with the governor's office to make sure these dollars are either inside the formula or outside of the formula based on his executive budget recommendation. And consider what you've been asked to consider in regards to the MFP Task Force's recommendations to ensure equitable distribution of any new dollars that are allocated, if there are any at the end of the day. And that's the whole point of being up here. We don't want to jeopardize that effort. So we need to get it right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Richard. Board, before we go to you for comments, let me read into the record. We do have some wishing not to speak. In favor, the support recommendation is Leslie Lavoie with Democrats for Education Reform, Louisiana. And then not wishing to speak, but opposing, Karen Artis, Brittany Barnett, Tucker Barnett, Chris Adley, Mylinda Elliott, Melissa Brose, Terry Coombs, Chase Brose, Pam Carey, and Brandy Melissa. Thank you, Superintendent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, just because I recognize this is complicated policy, I'll clarify a couple of things. You have one power under the Constitution when it comes to the MFP, and that is to approve a formula. What you have in front of you is a formula and nothing other than a formula. You cannot vote on something that is not in front of you and that you do not even have the power to vote on. So there is no question as to whether or not what you're voting on today is in the formula. That's all that you have to vote on. It's in the formula. The question as to whether or not you think it's the right formula, that's a question for your consideration. We have proposed to add $18 million annually into the formula that will be protected and that will recur. It is important from our perspective that these things continue to be placed in the formula so that schools no longer experience these annual vicissitudes of wondering, will the legislature appropriate funds from outside the formula or not? We don't think schools should have to rely on annual politics and June and July negotiations or June negotiations until we know about funding for next year. But please make no mistake about it, you do not have anything in front of you other than a formula. Thus, everything you're voting on is in the formula. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Superintendent. So, Board, you have that in your handout. You can see the edits to the formula that we're proposing to approve. Ms. Bochet?
Okay,
Please make sure you speak into the mic, Ms. Bochet.
all right, I'm trying, can I be heard?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'm on the MFP task force, and as I've said before, I was on the original one back in the early 90s that helped create this complex formula as it has evolved over the years. It was originally set up, there we go, it was originally set up to be a block grant. But over the years, there have been dedications because of legislative mandates or people thinking it was easier to get something passed if it was put in that particular way. But what we have right now, which is really a formula that bears some resemblance to what we began with many years ago, but with many modifications being made over time, over different governors, over different legislators, or legislative bodies, or sessions, and we're, I don't want to say stuck with, but what we have at this point. My gut reaction, and what I think should happen, from a personal standpoint, is when dollars are added, this was always meant to be a block grant for the administrative bodies in each school system to apportion those resources as they felt was most needed within their systems, whether it be now a traditional system or a public charter school system or school. And over time, these restrictions have been put in. In light of the current situation in the state, I think there is more of a will to fund specific, I guess, dedications as opposed to putting money in on a per pupil basis where the school systems have discretion. The MFP task force recommended three things, that there would be three funding mechanisms in priority order to increase the per pupil, to increase the high cost services fund, and to increase the supplemental course allocation. Now, having said that, it looks like we're looking at a formula that's going to change that priority a little bit and really do the last two as opposed to the first one, which is an increase in the per pupil. And with the climate of the state now, I do think that this is something that we need to do, even though it goes against what I personally believe should happen. But I just want to make clear to everyone that even if this formula is sent to the legislature, and if it passes, this represents a reduction in funding for public education in this state. We had $44 million outside the formula at the beginning of last year. We had 44 million. It was cut 24 million down to 20. If by some chance we're able to secure this additional 18 million for these two specified purposes and put it inside the formula, the chances of getting additional money outside the formula are slim. So that's an immediate $2 million reduction over funding for this year before we start. With the increase in the employer portion of the retirement, that 1.5% increase, that represents to traditional public schools and to some charters who participate in the public retirement system, that represents a decrease of over 38 million, because those are monies that have to be pulled from the classroom and sent to the retirement system. So we're looking basically, in order to operate our system, before you look at anything else, at a $40 million decrease over last year's funding. And I think that's something that needs to be reported and said. So if we even adopt this formula today and send it as is to the legislature, I think we're looking at a $40 million decrease in monies that we have used to operate our school system this current year. Because those monies for the increase in the retirement have to come out of other funds that we use, materials and supplies, all types of different student needs, special education, everywhere within the budget. Those have to come out. So we would be adopting a $40 million decrease. Now, talking about, Mr. Falk and Mr. Richard, who are up here, who have been for years on these task forces, we sat here last year and the year before and trying to get what the true cost of public education is. Because it is time, I think, that this formula needs to be revisited and somewhat of an overhaul done in looking not only in terms of what's equitable, but in terms of what's adequate and what is the true cost of public education. And that's going to be a very difficult process. And it seems like every year we come up, and every year it's, well, with the financial climate of the system now and of the state now and the political considerations, this is what we're going to do as a stopgap measure. So at some point in the near future, I think we need to get into looking at, does this formula serve the children of our state as is? Mr. Fleming and Ms. Reynolds are absolutely correct. When we're taking money out of this formula and you look at those calculations and you're sending that per pupil from one system to another system, you're not taking into consideration the weighted values. It's the average per pupil. And that, to me, seems inherently wrong and needs to be revisited. I'm not saying to do this within the next 10 minutes or one day, but it really needs to be looked at as we move forward for next year's allocations. I mean, those weighted values are put in there for a reason. And whether it's a traditional public school or a charter public school, whatever types of students those schools serve, and there are many charter schools that would benefit by that calculation, with a greater amount of at-risk students or a greater amount of special education students. But we need to look at the weighted values as those monies go back and forth. So at some point, this really has to be analyzed and maybe made a little bit more equitable within the structure that we have right now, with an eye toward overhauling. I think it's time that we overhauled this formula to reflect a true, the true cost of public education. Now, whether the governor's budget, and I agree with Superintendent White, whether the governor's budget has the money, $18 million, inside his executive budget or outside, the formula that we're adopting, because I went over I'm briefly looking at level 4, and I'm looking on page 13 of 23 on this MFP formula. And when it comes to the supplemental course allocation, it's increased from $26 to $59 per student who meet in grades 7 through 12. Now, I don't have my little calculator with me, but I'm assuming that increase of, $33 per student comes out to about $10 million. Is that correct, Superintendent?
That's correct.
That's correct. Now, in the high-cost services, I'm not exactly sure where it shows that, but I'm assuming the language within the resolution in the high-cost services accounts for the additional
$8
$8 million.
Yes.
So whether the governor has it inside or outside, the formula that we're sending over is asking the legislature to adopt this thing with the money inside. Now, whether it flies or not, again, is going to be up to their vote. But we would be sending over a formula that has the $18 million increase included. My preference, personal preference, is that it would be in the per pupil. Because as a person who runs a school system, that's where I need the flexibility. Because when I have all of the different students in my school system and the different schools and the configurations and the different makeups and the different programs, I would like the autonomy to make the decision on where the greatest need is for these funds. But in reality, when I look at the situation as a whole and have to vote on this, then I am going to vote in support of the proposed MFP.
Thank you, Ms. Bochet. We appreciate your comments. Dr. Jones, you had something to add?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on the MFP, and I have observed the process over numerous years, both as a superintendent and when I represented the organization and so forth. And I would echo two things. Number one, what BESE is approving today is the formula, not the numbers that you see in here. It's the formula that you use to arrive at. But basically this is, as I would say, is a simulation of what happens if BESE approves that number to send over to the warrant to the day. Second thing is that very clearly that money is in this formula as it goes. Now what happens to money outside the formula is really out of BESE's control. Money that's outside the formula is taken care of by the legislature and the governor, and we can lobby for it all we want to and so forth. But the reality is what BESE sends over there as a warrant is what the legislature considers and ultimately accepts it or sends it back. And when they send it back, then we sit down and go through the process again to figure out what it's going to take to get it approved. And if we don't get it done, at the end of the day, there's a process for what happens if we never reach an agreement with them, which essentially is that it goes back to last year's formula, more or less. I mean, there's some technicalities, but I'm hitting around the general edge of it. So the point I would make here is that in all the discussions today about inside or outside, all we need to look at is what is this formula we're sending over. After that, it's what happens when it gets to the legislature, who is more successful at making it. And everybody knows that right now in Louisiana, we got more month left at the end of the money than we got money left at the end of the month. So the reality is that whether you call it a cut or whether you call it a standstill budget or whether you say that there was more money last year and costs are rising, that's true. But that's also true for every department in the state of Louisiana. So we all have to look at the formula in balance to what the resources are and what we can accomplish with those resources.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. I thank you both for referencing the reality we live in. Dr. Bofi?
I want to first thank our members who serve on the task force and then the individuals in the audience who serve on the task force. I know this is a lot of hard work for you guys to have these debates and then bring a proposal to us. I have a question. I hear $38 million for retirement. Is that a $38 million increase?
Yes.
So what's the total that our districts are spending on retirement?
31%, I believe. Is that right? Is that right, Scott?
It's up to, it's 28 point something, I think, for teachers and a little higher for school employees.
Yeah.
But the total amount of money, I really, be honest, I don't remember. Definitely, probably.
But
it's
bottom line is we're approaching nearly a third of funds being taken off the top. So it's a totally fair point that's being made. Now the particulars of how that retirement contribution is arrived at is obviously a matter of great debate, but it's a fair point that the law obligates school systems to contribute, and so you have to see an increase in that context.
Superintendent, you have a number? We'll keep
Number
very
for
germane.
teacher retirement is 26.2 next year, and for Louisiana school employees, it's over 30%.
Thank you, sir.
So Mr. Richard brought this point up. We were at a meeting of the joint committees of the legislature, and Mr. Richard brought this up relative to, I think, some indicators of our state overall and spending and those kinds of things. And I'm just curious if anybody's going to tackle this issue. I mean, if we're spending 30% of the budget, 26% for teachers, 30% for other individuals, I mean, like, that's a problem. Is there anybody who's working on the problem?
Well, first, let me just say this. It was legislation passed that is addressing the unfunded accrued liability. This is a situation created by the legislature and prior legislators. When this retirement system was set up, and I think it was back in 1936, If I remember, it started out with an unfunded accrued liability because the legislature at that time gave every educator who was placed in the system their years of experience, their degrees, but did not fund the future payout for that. And that has continued over the years as legislation has passed or adding more people without bringing in the appropriate amount of money to fund their future payouts. If you look at the normal cost of the retirement system, the normal cost, if there was not an unfunded liability, it would be less than what we would pay for Social Security. It's less than the 6.2%. It's 5 point something or whatever it is. So if we didn't have that unfunded accrued liability hanging over our head, it would cost less for teacher retirement, the employer course portion, than it would be to enroll them in Social Security. Now, even if we switched over, because I know there's a lot of talk about making it a defined contribution plan as opposed to a defined benefit plan, but even if that was made, which I'm totally against, but even if that move was made, the unfunded accrued liability still exists. So you would have to pay into whatever new retirement structure you're putting, whether it's Social Security and 401k or however you want to structure it, and still be responsible for paying the unfunded accrued liability. So it would be an increased cost to our school systems to switch over at this point, because the unfunded accrued liability still has to be addressed.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Bochet. And Dr. Wilkie, appreciate the question on that. And Dr. Jones, will go to you, but this is not a discussion on unfunded accrued liability or retirement per se. So let's keep it somewhat brief on that.
I'll keep it real brief. The thing here that people have to understand about that number that's in there is not only is it calculating 6.2% or whatever that number is, I know it's around 6%, it's also calculating the debt service that is attached to that unfunded accrued liability going back to 1936. And so the reality is every year they have to make a budget projection as to what it takes to take care of that debt service, but also collect that money for future payouts for those teachers that are currently still in the system.
Thank you.
Is that brief enough?
Yes, great. Thank you. Dr. Bob, did you have anything you want to add? Your point well taken.
Thank you. I would like to see people work on solutions to this issue.
Absolutely.
Because we're approaching 2036, and I don't see anybody working on a solution here.
Well, the legislature has passed something that is addressing the initial one that will be paid down, and in another 5 years, we're going to see it drop, a tremendous drop. So they have been working on it.
Ms. Emerson, did you have a question?
Yes, I just want to go back to what we were talking about in some of the testimony, and I want Superintendent to address Mr. Fleming and Ms. McReynolds and the weighted part of the amount per pupil. It's not weighted. Can you explain that just a little bit so that I can understand that better?
When a student goes from a charter school to a district school or a district school to a charter school, the way that the MFP should work, I think in all of our views, is that the dollars should go to that school. In the past, the way the law was written regarding how charter schools were funded made it so that average dollars would go, meaning if I don't have a disability, I get a little bit more because I'm averaged with students who have disabilities. If I do have a disability, I'm a little bit less because that's not right. So working with Sean and others, the dollars were changed, the state dollars were changed to reflect weights. And the issue, and he's shaking his head, but the issue that I understand that they're voicing is that the local dollars are not weighted. They're still averaged.
Okay, the state dollars are weighted,
Correct.
but the local dollars are not weighted.
That's the issue that they're voicing.
Okay.
Now, why is that?
Yeah.
Because the way the law was written tells the state to weight the state dollars, but not to weight the local dollars. If there's an interest in changing that law, the legislature should change that law. Our finance people and attorneys are abiding by the law.
Okay. So that would be a legislative decision, not a decision of BESE, is what you're saying.
Correct. It is fair to say that the law and the BESE formula are a little bit tied together on this. In
Okay.
other words, it's unclear exactly which drives how dollars flow through the system. Is it the laws that have long been accepted regarding how charter schools are funded, or is it the formula that allocates money to schools? You might know, for example, that this structure as to how charter schools are funded is in litigation right now that's being heard at an appellate and a Supreme Court level. That gives you a sense of just how complicated this is.
Right.
My view is that probably both things, both the formula and the statutes, need to change to
Okay.
reflect the kind of change that's being
That would be
discussed.
my recommendation.
But my main point is that, as Ms. Voce said, it is an extremely complicated thing. If you want to move in that direction, it's a fine conversation to have. But you can't just talk about what's good in policy. You have to talk about what's actually in the law. And as we read the law directs us to weight state dollars, but not to weight local dollars.
Thank you.
The other
Ms.
thing I
Voce?
wanted to say, Mr. Davis.
I'm sorry, hold on 1 minute. Ms. Everson?
I wanted to reiterate what Ms. Fauché said, and that is that I believe that it obviously is time that we dive into MFP, and I just wanted to sort of second that, and hopefully the board will agree that sooner rather than later, we will have something more than just a task force to really tackle the MFP in the state.
Just a quick note on that. You may know that one of the MFP task force's recommendations for the last 3 years has been a comprehensive study.
Yeah.
We then contracted as a board with LSU, Jim Richardson, who's currently doing the whole state's revenue structure coordination task force. He was leading that. To give you a demonstration of how bad the fiscal times are, the legislature cut the contract. So, this is, and Dr. Jones alluded to this, this is a very difficult time in which to make these decisions, because as much as we might want to talk about adequacy and all of these things, you don't have much room to move without taking money from people who are essentially already getting cut. And that's true for public schools and private schools. So I'm not trying to be despondent. I'm just telling you that we can talk about all these things, but the margins for movement right now are very limited.
Thank you. Ms. Voce, you have a comment?
Yeah, I know Mr. Fleming and shaking his head no about the state allocation. And I'm not 100% sure on this. I'm sure Beth could answer this much better than I could. But I think that there is the movement of the funds from the state, from the school district to the public charters. You do the February 1 count from the prior year based on weighted values, then you're taking, as the kids come in, the average per pupil, even from the state portion, to send. So I think that I'm not sure if the state monies that go are weighted funds. I really think they're both an average per pupil. But Beth, is that correct?
Why don't you come up and...
Yeah,
because
I'm
this
not
is
sure
of
that
that,
that's
so I'd like her to
directly conflicting
clarify.
what you're saying.
That's Sienna with the department.
Speak up a little
Speak
bit,
up a little
please.
bit, ma'am.
Okay. The Title 17 change that required weighting of the state share is in full swing. In other words, we weight all the state share based on the characteristics of the students in all the charter schools, just like we do all the regular school systems. So the money that is sent forward at any point to the charter schools, just like it goes to the districts, is all weighted. So if you have a higher percentage of special ed students, then those monies follow the child.
The state portion.
The state portion, yeah, that's correct.
You have a question for
Yeah,
Beth?
I do. Beth, I know that when all the students are put into your district's count and the weights are applied, when the money is then transferred from the traditional district to the charter, does it go child by child with his individual weight, or is it the average weighted value?
It is child by child. We actually now have to account for every child's individual characteristics. The data system provides us that information. There is a chart that we post on the MFP on the website that shows the value of each of the characteristics. So whatever that child generates per those individual characteristics is what follows them to the charter school.
Okay, and just the state portion does that?
Just the state portion, correct.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do I have any other comments from the board around this?
Just real quickly, Tony, so that I could understand this. So the local portion, we don't have any jurisdiction over the local portion, is that right? To wait or not to wait? Because that's, I mean, explain that. I'm sorry. I want to make sure I understand that.
The law, there is a law regarding how charter schools are funded that determines essentially the mechanics of once the MFP is created, once the dollars are appropriated, how they shall flow through the system. We read that law to be that those dollars shall be, the state dollars shall be distributed on a weighted basis. A kid with these needs to this school, those needs to that school. But that the state's calculation of the local funds shall not be weighted. It shall be as it has been. And so as a result, you have this discussion. We don't think this is exclusively at least, a BESE level decision. We think that the laws need to change also, or you'll have a contradictory, pieces of policy.
Sean's still shaking his head.
Well, that covers it for this conversation, however, for right now.
Right. I have my questions answered. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Simpson. If I have no other comments from the board, do I have any objections to the motion? With no objections, the motion carries. Next item of business, please.
On page 23, item 5.1, consideration of federal and state grants and allocations to LEAs, Type 2 charters, Type 5 charters, approved non-public schools, and community-based organizations, competitive and other. The recommendation is to approve. An updated exec rec and backup documentation for this item, which included the school redesign planning grant allocation, were posted on March the 2nd, and a handout has been distributed to the committee.
Do we have any, I need a motion, please, to approve this recommendation. Dr. Bofi, need a second?
Second.
Mr. Rock?
Members, you will note that, again, these are allocations based on grant programs. Most grants, not all, but most are federally funded. So you'll see funds related to federal grants that are specifically for charter schools. You'll see grants specifically related to early childhood, as those funds are federal funds. School redesign funds to help the most struggling schools kick off the process of comprehensive improvement. And then funding for issues like LEAs that have been impacted by floods and federal funds that are specific to that. Substitute reimbursements for districts that have had teachers participating in the science standards development process. Also, school systems being reimbursed for that process, as well as some of the support work for educator preparation support in these districts. So these are almost exclusively, not always, but almost exclusively federal funds going through to districts and charter schools through competitive grants that the federal government either runs or gives the state the ability to run.
Thank you, Superintendent. Ms. Loche?
Again, I would just ask, John, because I can tell from some of the reading of the content, but instead of just putting federal funds on there, could you please put the source of the federal fund, whether it's Title I, IDEA, Title II, whatever the funding source is, please, on these from now on?
I think it's in there, right? Is it?
Well, it just says federal. Sometimes in the verbiage you see it, other times you don't.
Got it. But we did do as directed before, which is in the charts to include the breakouts, right? Okay. So we will adopt that from now on in the title pages as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other comments from the board?
I need to recuse myself. Do I do that now? Or are we going to vote on these things separately, or this is all one?
No, you just recuse yourself at this point.
Okay, from the McKinney-Pinto flood. I'm sorry.
There's a motion to approve.
There's a motion to approve.
Dr. Bofi.
Okay. Is this the proper time?
I recuse myself.
Ms. Holloway recused.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else in recuse? Okay. Any other comments from the board? If there are no other comments, are there any objections? With no objection, the motion carries. Next item of business, please.
On page 40, item 5.2, consideration of LDE contracts over $50,000. The recommendation is to approve.
I need a motion, please. So moved. Dr. Thompson, and second by Dr. Bofi.
Members, this is a contract to continue the funding of something called a Resource and Referral Center, which is a long-time structure that exists largely for the professional development of child care centers. These structures also in Louisiana raise tax credits that then go to corporations and the proceeds from which are used also to subsidize professional development and support for child care centers. This is essentially the funding that for 2 years that funds these centers to exist. It's federal funds, specifically the Child Care Assistance Program, and you are creating and continuing to fund these entities through this grant. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Do you have any questions or comments from the board?
I have a question. I can't find what I wanted to ask. There was somewhere in here, maybe somebody can direct me, I can't find it now, but for mental health services for early childhood, somewhere in here I saw mental health services. I just wanted to ask a question about exactly what that would entail. And I know I saw it, just
it might be worth providing a little bit of commentary, but I can say that the resource and referral centers provide comprehensive supports to child care centers.
Right, and that would be part of that comprehensive support. But could I hear a little bit about that?
I think our people who are particularly close to that work aren't present today.
Okay.
But we're happy to get the information to you if that's helpful.
Okay, thank you. Because there's been a cry for a long time for mental health services for pre-K and under children. We're having more and more issues, so if you could get that to me, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from the board? If there are no other comments, do I have any objections to the motion? With no objection, the motion carries. Next item, please.
On page 115, item 6.2, consideration of RSD contracts and leases of $50,000 and over. The recommendation is to approve.
Dr. Murphy, need a second, please? Mr. Garvey. Do I have any discussion or anybody from the department?
These are related to the ongoing work of the school reconstruction in the city of New Orleans.
Any particular questions or comments from the board? Hearing none, are the objections to the motion? Hearing none, the motion carries. Next item, please.
On page 122, item 7.1, consideration of the ratification of the submission of the legislative report to the Louisiana Legislature regarding House Concurrent Resolution 137 of the 2016 regular legislative session submitted by the BESE President per interim authority. The recommendation is to ratify.
Can I get a motion to ratify, please? Dr. Jones, any second? Mr. Garvey. Any objections to the ratification? With no objections, we've ratified that. Next item of business, please.
This concludes your agenda.
Thank you very much.